Greetings, everybody, and welcome to ROLLBACK, our brand new YouTube-only format where we share the best evergreen conversations from our pre-video catalog with all of you. Today, we bring you episode number 243 from August of 2016, where I had the great honor of sitting down with one of the legendary basketball coaches of all time, George Raveling. Affectionately known as just Coach, George is many things. He's Nike's director of international basketball. He was the first African-American assistant coach of Villanova, the first African-American assistant coach at University of Maryland, and 7 years spent as head coach at USC, where he became quite active and outspoken on social issues at the intersection of race, education, and athletics. George retired from coaching in 1994, but to this day is considered one of the most respected and revered figures in not just basketball, but in all of sport. He is a national treasure, just an absolute gem of a human being, a man full of life experiences and incredible stories, not the least of which is how on August 28, 1963, George came to be standing alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the podium on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington as Dr. King delivered his historic I Have a Dream speech. There is so much more to this extraordinary story, but I don't want to spoil anything for you, so please enjoy this rollback to a mind-blowing episode with Coach George Raveling. So we were introduced to each other by our mutual friend, Ryan Holiday, who I'm a big fan of. I know you are as well.
Absolutely. I tell him I'm president of his fan club.
He's got quite a fan club, and he speaks very, very highly of you. He was insistent that we get together, and any friend of Ryan's is a friend of mine. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to spend a little time with you today.
Well, I echo the same sentiments for you. It's an honor for me to be on your podcast.
I appreciate that. And just to set the stage, we're sitting in this beautiful library that is wall-to-wall books, floor to ceiling. Have you read all of these books?
No. The answer is no. But I've read.
People send you a lot of books.
I buy a lot of books, but people send them to me too. But I'm well fortified if the bookstores go out of business. I'll have enough books in here to last me for the rest of
I think you're good.
My lifetime. So I'm well stocked, and I keep buying them.
Well, you should, right? And I think reading is a big part of your story. We're going to get into the background and all of that, but I know that reading is very important to you, and you have your reading with Rav, right? Is that what it's called? That goes way back.
Raveling, yes, I started that back in the 70s.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. The importance of reading to you, and kind of your advocacy around that.
Well, I think at the time we had not become a technological society in the sense that we are today. But I think early on I realized the unique value of information. I used to tell my players that perhaps the two most important commodities in the world were information and money. If you've got money, you can buy information. If you got information, you can get plenty of money. And little did I know that we'd evolve into a culture that we presently live in, where it's so dominated by information, and so much information is readily available to us that you can. If a person wanted to self-educate themselves, all they have to do is get a smartphone and use Google servers. About anything you can imagine, if you Google it, you'll get anywhere from 10 to 20 articles on it. And so I think that it's comforting for me to know that I can continue to educate myself at 79 and take myself from where I am to perhaps where I should be intellectually and from a knowledge gathering standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I think technology is really shifting how we learn and how we educate ourselves. It's democratizing it in a large way, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out over the next 10 or 20 years and the impact that has on the value of the college experience and college education when you can kind of take those matters into your own hands, regardless of your socioeconomic situation.
And that's a great point. It really renders the excuse that we have poor teachers or poor schools, it really marginalizes that rationale now, because if you have poor books or poor teachers, teach yourself, and all you have to have is a smartphone to be able to do it. But to race back to the reading with Raveling, I started in the 70s, and I felt that a lot of the young people that I came in contact with were not avid readers, and when I asked them why, they said that it's boring. And so I tried to be an active listener, and they didn't say they didn't like to read, they just said it was boring. So I started to think to myself, if I can present to them the right topics, maybe I can get them hooked on reading. So if a kid liked music, I give him books about music. If he likes sports, I give him books about sports. I tried to make his ascension from where he was to where he could be reading-wise easy for him, and not to give him the most complex books. And the other avenue that I discovered, is particularly for younger people, is to read to them. Mm-hmm. Because there's always a childlike characteristic in all of us. Even at 79, I still enjoy hearing nice, intriguing stories. And so I think when you read to a child, it stimulates their mind, it takes them on a mental journey, it heightens their curiosity. And so what I tried to do was to give books to young people and not reward them for reading them. When they'd bring them back, I'd give them a little test, and I'd reward them for reading. And over the years, I began to realize that I'd struck upon something from an ethnic standpoint, and that is that back in the days of slavery, the plantation owners used to hide their money in the books and put the books up on the shelves, because they never worried about the slaves stealing the books or the money, because they couldn't read.
Terrible.
And so how I translated that was that as long as someone can control your mind, they can control your body. And so if we don't allow people to possess our minds, then they cannot possess our bodies. And so how do we achieve that? By filling our head with as much information, as much knowledge, as much material as we possibly can. And along the way, either by intent or unintended consequence, is that it stimulates your critical and analytical thinking. It's just a byproduct of it. At some point, if you read enough, it's gonna cause you to think different, to act different, and to be different.
Mm-hmm. But it requires a certain level of self-discipline and willingness. And it reminds me of a speech that you gave that I listened to the other day. I think it's from 1977. It was on your podcast, where the basic theme of it was, it's up to you.
If it is to be, it's up to me.
Right.
That was a talk that I did to kids at our basketball camp back in the 70s. And as cliche as it sounds, I think it's a powerful statement. Research would substantiate it. And that is that at the end of the day, nobody's going to row our boat for us but ourselves. Our lives are going to be lived in a relatively orderly manner. And so either our hands are going to be on the steering wheel of our life, or someone else's hands are going to be on the steering wheel of our lives. And I prefer that I govern my life and the way I think. And I've been actually, you're probably the first one that I've talked to publicly about this, but I've been working on this theory that I'm going to continue to work on over the year until I get it really well defined. But I call it environmental control. And the theory behind this is, if you can control the environment in which you live, then you can create the necessary environment to live a peaceful, productive life, to be happy, if in fact happiness is something that's important to you. And so we the idea is to create a community within this universal community, and I can control the community that I live in. I can control the people I associate with, the books I read, my values, what I watch on television, how I think. We have a lot more control over our lives than we realize that we do. I just don't think that our thinking is maybe as sophisticated as it could be or would be if everyone decided once and for all that I'm going to be the captain of my ship. I'm going to control my destiny. I'm going to create a path to success for me. And if they started to control the people that they choose to be around, what they listen to, what they watch, their values. I think it's very easy to do, and I didn't actually think about this a whole lot until the last 4 or 5 years, but I really have put that into play. I'm very watchful of what I eat, where I go, what I do. And I try to create an environment in which I feel that I can exist and feel like I'm making progress. I'm not a person that believes in happiness. I think, to me, happiness is if you spend your whole life chasing happiness, I think you're going to be chasing a ghost, because the bar is always going to be moving, and most times happiness is validated by someone else. And so, to me, rather than go through all the anxiety of being happy, I never talk. This is the first time, actually, in a long time that I even talked about happiness, because I try to eradicate that word from my vocabulary.
The idea of happiness as some sort of destination.
Yes.
But I would presume that purpose and engagement, sort of supplants the idea of happiness.
Yes.
In terms of being a contented and directed individual.
Right. I'd be more great. You picked a perfect word as it relates to me. I'm more interested in being contented than I am being happy, because then I realize that these are momentary existence, but you're always reaching, and you get to a point that you live and manifest something I learned at Nike when I working there, and their mantra is there is no finish line. You're constantly asking yourself what's next. I remember Phil Knight saying to me one time, the minute you think you've won, you're starting to lose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nothing is static.
Yes.
And, in between the lines, what I'm hearing you speak to is this idea of self-determinism, right?
Yes.
The idea that you can control your environment, the adage that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with,
Yes.
and the extent to which we can control some of these factors. And that is an idea that I believe in wholeheartedly, but it also butts up against this kind of victim narrative that seems to populate the news and, our culture at the moment. The idea that everybody is a victim, and, there's a lot of finger pointing and blaming other people for the circumstances of our lives. And, on some level, you're a rebuttal to that, I would say. Is that?
Well, as it relates to me, and the minute you start to try to reach out into these other communities and connect with them, even if it's by way of conversation or just mentally, I think that you now run the risk that they're going to try to validate who you are, what you say, or what you do. And I'm really, I think I'm perfectly capable of validating myself. I don't have to live by someone else's norms or standards for validation. I used to say in a talk that I did that the hardest battle that a person has to fight in their lifetime is to live in a world where every single day someone's trying to make you be someone you don't want to be. I think I know who I want to be. I don't need someone to try to make me be who they want me to be or to live by their values. And that I respect their values. I respect their way of life, and I hope that they would do the same for me.
Well, let's track it back. The superhero origin story, so to speak. You lived through some very interesting times, some pivotal times in our history, and you've played a significant role not just in sport but in the culture at large through your involvement in the civil rights movement, et cetera. But where does it all begin? I know it begins in Washington, D.C., and had a sort of an interesting family situation when you were a kid.
Yeah, it actually, as I look quickly, you try to reflect on it, and you probably touched upon a real important item in my life, and that was the Washington, D.C. I was born in Washington, D.C. Then you fast forward to the March on Washington, which was in Washington, D.C. But I grew up in Washington, D.C. during the Depression when things were rationed. Sugar was rationed, flour, and so forth. And so when I was 9 years old, my dad died, and when I was 13, my mom had a nervous breakdown, and she was institutionalized at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C. for most of the rest of her life. And so now what happens is, by and large, I'm an orphan. And so what do you do with George? And so my grandmother was really the matriarch of our family. I always envisioned her like the Pope. She was infallible. Whatever she said went. And so my grandma worked for this white family in Georgetown, and she had mentioned to them about the circumstances. And so the lady of the house said, well, I think that her daughter's name was Rachel. She said, well, Rachel works for the Catholic Charities. She might be able to help you. And lo and behold, she did. She was able to get me in a Catholic boarding school in upstate Pennsylvania, in a place called Holborn Heights, Pennsylvania. Geographically, it falls between Scranton and Pittston, Pennsylvania, up in the northeastern part of the state. And so I finished the rest of my education there. I finished up grade school, or what we would call junior high, and then I went to high school.
And growing up without, a father and a mother, and sort of being raised by your grandmother and bouncing around a little bit, I would imagine that's where the seeds of, self-determinism probably, were planted originally, right? This idea that you're going to have to be responsible for yourself and having to shoulder that mantle at a very young age.
Yeah, I didn't have the luxury that comes with a family and a mom and dad, in the sense that I didn't have someone there that was scripting out my day well, I did, but it was a lot different, because when you're in a family, there might only be 4 or 5 of you, but at the school where I was, there were over 200 young men there, and basically we were in a very disciplined environment. In order to sort of pay your way, you had to do chores at the school. So the time that I was there, I did everything from clean out chicken coops to picking eggs, baling hay, working in the bakery, scrubbing the chapel floors on my hands and knees, working in the laundry. By the time that I graduated from there, I was fully trained to live the rest of my life and be able to take care of myself. Even to this day, I get up every morning and I iron my pants and my shirt before I go off to work. And I'm 79 years old.
Yeah, you make your bed, you bounce a nickel off it.
Well, it was funny when I was in the Army, and a lot of people get surprised when I tell them I was in the Army, but there was a mandatory draft when I was there. And so in basic training, I did my basic training in Fort Knox, Kentucky. And so you had to make your bed every morning and stand for inspection. And I just assumed everybody knew how to make a bed, and guys were willing to pay me 50 cents to make their bed in the morning and that. And so but all those little fundamental lessons that I learned in school, they all came back to help me along the way. I mean, I even learned how to drive a tractor over the course of the time there. So what I did is I had a broad landscape of learning opportunities outside the classroom. It was one thing to be able to get tremendous formal education in the classroom, but when you can couple that with life lessons outside of the classroom, that's a unique opportunity to grow and learn.
And that's a theme that I think kind of overarches your coaching career, right? The idea that these aren't just athletes. It's not just about, what happens, at practice or during the game, but it's about shaping the hearts and minds of these young men.
For me, what I concluded later in life is that for me, athletics were the vehicle that transported me along in life and dropped me off at the right bus stops along the way. And I'd stop for a while and learn and get back on. Athletics would take me a little further. I would have never been able to go to college if it wasn't for basketball. And I tell you an interesting story. When I was a senior in high school, I was the second leading scorer in the state of Pennsylvania. And so school started recruiting me. So one time we were playing this team, St. Rose of Carbondale, Pennsylvania. And when I came out after the game, a gentleman came up to me and he introduced himself. He says, "Hi, my name's Jack Ramsey. I'm the coach at St. Joe's College, and we were very interested in you." So I just listened. I was always taught, to when grown-ups talk, you keep your mouth shut and you listen. And so he said, and he went on and told me a little bit about St. Joe's and where it was located in Philadelphia and so forth. And then he said, "We're going to offer you a scholarship." And so he said, "We'll send something to you in writing." And I thanked him in that. And so when we got on the school bus to go back, my coach said to me, he said, "Who was that gentleman you were talking to?" And I told him what had happened. And I said to him, I said, "Coach, let me ask you a question. What's a scholarship?" I didn't even know what a scholarship was. And it was so foreign to me and to my family that when later, when it was just about time to graduate, my grandma didn't, for some reason I hadn't told her that about the scholarship. And so she was asking me, "Well, what are you going to do?" So I said, "Well, I'm going to go to college." And she said, "Well, how are you going to go to college? Who's going to pay for it?" And so I said, "Oh, I'm getting a scholarship." And so she didn't know what the scholarship was. So I explained to her. And so it seemed like for 2 minutes, but it was probably only 10 seconds. But she didn't say anything. So I said, "Well, Grandma, you look like you're puzzled." And she said, "Well, I am." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, because I thought I raised you better than that." And I said, "Well, you did. I think you've done a great job in raising me." And she says, "But I'm disappointed in myself because I can't believe that you're naive enough to think that some white people are going to pay for you to go to college just so you can play basketball. It makes no sense. They're tricking you." She says, it doesn't work. And, and that was during the height of segregation and that. She couldn't comprehend that white, black, blue, that anybody's going to pay for your education to play basketball.
Yeah, times have changed. But what was the kind of landscape of African American athletes when you were in boarding school? I mean, you must have been one of the few African American students in your school to begin with, right? And then
probably about 5% of the student body were at that time they called us either colored or Negroes, and so there were about probably. I'd say maybe 5% of the student body were what we would call today African Americans, and obviously we all participated in sports. One thing about the sports, from an unusual perspective, was it didn't take us long to figure out you wanted to participate in sports because you got to go off campus, and you got certain privileges. And so maybe instead of having to go and work in the bakery in the afternoon, I got to go to basketball practice. Right. So I played every sport. I played baseball, basketball, football, and boxing.
You were Golden Gloves of boxing, right?
Yeah, we had they had a Golden Glove boxing team, and so I went out for it. And whatever sport was going to get me some special privileges and get me off campus, I was for it.
But basketball was the thing.
Yes, and then I didn't actually start playing organized basketball until I was a freshman in high school, and I found out later. My godfather was a priest, and I found out later, probably when I was going in my senior year, that my godfather had made a deal with the coach that regardless of how poor I played that first year, that he wouldn't cut me from the team. He'd keep me on the team. And so I each year I got a little better and better, and but a lot of it was because I put a lot of time in trying to master the skills. And once again, there was a little bit of a strategy there, because if I went to the nuns did all the teaching at the school, and so if I went to my homeroom teacher and I said, Sister Dolores, I have to practice from 2 to 5 o'clock, well then she would give me permission to go over to the gym. And even in the off season, I would go in the gym every day and work on my fundamentals. And that we only had one coach. Our coach had played for the Redskins, but he coached every sport. He coached basketball, baseball, football, and boxing.
And that discipline to kind of go the extra mile and practice in off hours. At the time, your perception was not, this is my ticket out or my ticket to a new life. What was the drive? Just a personal sense of wanting to be as good as you could be?
Yes. I actually, at no time in my life did I ever say, well, when I grow up, I want to go to college. And never once in our household that when I was growing up did anyone ever say, George, when you grow up, we want you to go to college. That was unheard of. No one in my family had ever gone. So why did they think I was going to go? And so as I moved along, I began to realize that participating in athletic brought some residual of value for you, and so I utilized it to help myself grow and learn and get exposure, because I get off campus and I get a chance to see how the rest of the world lived, because television was in its very formative stages then. And so today a young person he has a much broader perspective of the world than I ever had in those days. But somewhere there was the hand of God, I guess, just pushing me along, and being in the right place at the right time helped me. But I don't know if I would have ever made it other than the discipline of the nuns and the time that they invested in me and motivated me. And my homeroom teacher, my senior year, her name was Sister Emmanuel, and we went through the entire year, and she would never, ever say anything positive to me. And then when she found out
just being a good nun.
Yeah. And when she found out I was going to get a scholarship, then I had to, it started to change, because then they'd made me stay every day after school, and I'd have to go through 2 hours of Latin, and they were preparing me for the test and teaching me word derivatives. And for example, if it's a multiple choice, the first thing you do is go through and eliminate the answers that can't possibly be, so you narrow it down. So I went through all those fundamental concepts of education. And so when I graduated, I said to her, Sister Emmanuel, I said, you realize in the entire year you've never said anything positive to me. And she looked at me and smiled, and she said, Mr. Raveling, do you think maybe there was a method to my madness? And
yeah, it seemed to work, right?
Yes. Because I was always trying to do something extra just so she'd say I did a good job, and she never would.
Right. Well, you thrive under this, Catholic education umbrella, and then you take that not to St. Joe's, but to Villanova. Continuing in the Catholic tradition, right? And you become quite a standout basketball player there. I think, 835 rebounds or something like that during your career. Successful by any stretch of the imagination. But even then, it wasn't about, I'm going to become a professional basketball player. Professional basketball looked very different back then.
Well, there weren't as many teams, and And so my junior and senior year, we were ranked, nationally ranked. And so when they had 6 rounds of the NBA draft at that time, and I got drafted in the 2nd round by the Philadelphia Warriors, which is now the Golden State Warriors. And so the owner was a guy named Eddie Gottlieb, and I went down and I met with him, and we talked, and they had a stacked lineup. They had Paul Arizin and Woody Salisbury and Wilt Chamberlain and Guy Rogers and those type of players, most of whom went on to be in the Hall of Fame. And so it wasn't that they needed me, but he did say that I would be challenged to make the lineup. But he said, this will show you the difference in compensation. He said, we'd be willing to sign you for $7,500.
Right.
and
you were already working at Sunoco, right?
Yeah,
at that time, you were making more money in a corporate job than you would have
Sunoco, I was in a management training program, and they were paying me. They were paying me more than that in the management training program. So, and it wasn't something that I could ever see myself making a career out of it. And so, and as I said, I don't know one young man my age who ever said to me, if I can just make the NBA, I'll be really happy. No, that wasn't a destination point for blacks in those days to play in the NBA. And what I had an older cousin who went to Dartmouth and then on to Georgetown Law School and subsequently became a federal judge. And he was kind of my role model before I knew what a role model was. And so I always wanted to be like him. And so he wore khaki pants all the time. So I wore khaki pants. So whatever he did, I did. So my idea was, okay, I'll when I graduate, I'll go to law school. And that was my pursuit. But what's even more interesting when I look back on it, before I got to be a senior and the scholarship came into play, I can distinctly remember our school set up on a bluff, and down at the bottom was a highway, and the Greyhound bus came by there. And so that was how I'd get on the Greyhound bus and take that long journey from Pennsylvania on the Greyhound bus till I got to Washington, D.C. And so I remember sitting up there waiting for the bus to come, and I was thinking to myself, boy, if I can just become a pilot in the Air Force, I'll have it made. And that was the extent of my dreams then, was to go into the Air Force and try to become a pilot. I had no idea that I was ever going to go to college.
But fate has a different path for you.
Yes.
And nonetheless, you get pulled back into basketball, first as an assistant coach at Villanova, while you were still working your job, right?
Yes.
You were sort of like it was like
I
sort of a moonlighting
I
thing.
might have been the original part-time assistant. But
and were you the first? This starts like this wave of you being the first of in many situations. So you were the first African-American assistant coach in the ACC, yes?
Yeah, I was the first a black assistant coach at a predominantly white college. But we didn't have all the conferences. There was no Big East, and there was an ACC, but there was no there weren't a proliferation of conferences.
So was Villanova part of the ACC then?
At that time, Villanova was basically in a make-believe conference, and I say that because it didn't have a real conference structure to it, but it was called the Big Five, and the Big Five was LaSalle, St. Joe's, Temple, Penn, and Villanova. And so that was those schools in Philadelphia competed against each other, and whoever had the best record, they were the champion of the Big Five. But basically, in those days, the Catholic schools were independent, what we call independent today. But most Catholic schools, particularly on the eastern seaboard, all had outstanding basketball teams. Whatever school you name, from Canisius to Villanova to St. Joe's to Georgetown to Loyola, they all had great basketball teams.
So you must have been how old at this time, like 25 or something?
Yeah, I graduated. I went to Villanova 56 to 60, and I was 20 when I graduated from Villanova. So I was. You're right. I'd be right around 25.
Right. So that's probably like around 1962 or
Yes.
something like that. Right. So this is all happening set against a backdrop of, a pretty tumultuous time in our history with the civil rights movement and what was going on down in Selma with, Dr. King, et cetera. And you start to get interested in this movement by way of a friend and a family friend who kind of, initiate you into these conversations about, sort of race in America, which then leads you to show up on the Mall in 1963 to hear Dr. King. So walk us through this extraordinary experience that you have.
Well, this is one of those situations.
I know you've told the story a million times, but
this is one of those
I'm going to make you do it.
That I characterized earlier when I said that being in the right place at the right time. On a Wednesday night, my best friend, he lived in Claymont, Delaware, and Claymont, Delaware is right on the border of Pennsylvania, and from Villanova to Claymont's maybe an hour and some change. And so I was down at their house for dinner, and my friend's name was Warren Wilson. His dad was a very prominent black dentist in Wilmington. And so we were having dinner, and in those days, the family is always gathered for the evening meal, and there was always a conversation. And so Dr. Wilson asked us if we were going to go to the March on Washington that weekend, and we said no. And he asked us why not. He said, "This is going to be a historic moment. You guys should be there." And so we gave him one of those adolescent excuses. We didn't have any money or way to get there. So he said, "Well, I can fix that." So he let us use the car, and he gave us money to go down there. So that Friday, we hopped in the car and we drove down to D.C. and we got a motel room on. At that time, there was Route 1 was the only thoroughfare in and out of D.C. going north and south. And so we found a hotel room or motel room on New York Avenue, and we decided that we'd drive down that evening, Friday evening, and just get our bearings and see what was going on. And while we were down there, we ran into this guy, and he said, "Hey, are you coming tomorrow?" And we said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, would you guys be interested in volunteering?" And we said, "For what?" He said, "Oh, we're going to have twice as many people as we thought we were going to have, and so we're going to have a double security, so we're looking for volunteers. Would you guys want to volunteer?" And we said, "Yes." So he said, "Be down here tomorrow morning at 9, and we woke up early and got down there, and we got down there about 8, maybe 8:15, and we found them, and he said, "Wow, you guys
right
are
on the steps
on the mall,
of the Lincoln Memorial,
the
right?
mall there, and where the reflecting pool and that is." And so he said, "You guys are here early." He said, "Well, we're going to double the security up at the speaker's podium because they had people speaking. John Lewis, who's now in Congress, was one of the early speakers that day. So it started from 9 in the morning, and King was the last speaker late in the evening around 5.
All day people speaking.
Yes, there's one speaker.
And everyone had like 6 minutes, right?
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Everybody was limited to 5 minutes, and you had to give them an advance copy of a speech for approval, and they made John Lewis change his about 10 times. James Baldwin refused to change his, and so they wouldn't let Baldwin speak. Mm-hmm. And so even King, the original speech was 5 minutes. And so what happened was there was a security structure, and particularly for King, as soon as he was done speaking, we were to engulf him and take him out the back way. And we had an exit plan if there was some kind of overt demonstration or violence.
Were you up by the podium the whole day, or just for Dr. King? Pictures.
Yeah. No, I was up there the whole day. And we got a break every now and then to go to grab there was a place in the back where you could go and get a sandwich and something cold to drink and that. But basically, I was on duty the entire time. And so throughout the course of the day, people were still coming in. And by the time King got up to speak, the place was, as far as you could see, was humanity. People, in fact, when we left that evening around 7:30 to head back up to Delaware, the people were still trying to get into D.C. and it was over. And it was bumper to bumper until we got to Baltimore. People still trying.
There's famous footage and images of just a sea of people all the way down the reflecting pool.
So King got up to speak and he was going through his prepared text, and he gets to a point when I would suggest he's probably 3/4 of the way through the prepared text, and you hear a female voice say, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." Was seated behind King were Mahalia Jackson, who most people would suggest is the greatest gospel singer of all time, and Marian Anderson. She had sang the national anthem, and so it was Mahalia Jackson who had encouraged Martin to tell about the dream. And so, what was the dream? The dream part, as King had used in the speech in Detroit earlier that week, and he had used it in Selma, and Mahalia Jackson was on both of those programs, so she was familiar with it and obviously inspired by it. And so at this point, King was the last speaker, and some people would say that he was the keynote speaker, but that wasn't true. They put King last because they know he would hold the crowd. And so at that point, he deviates from the speech and ad-libs in the "I have a dream" portion. And as a result was, he was the only speaker who went past the 5-minute mark.
Was there a moment when you, standing next to him, knew? Like, was it palpable in the moment? Like, okay, he's not referring to his notes anymore.
No, because I didn't have the notes. I didn't have the notes at that point.
But like, sort of kicking into a high gear. Like,
no, King was such a highly skilled orator that you were mesmerized. Your thought process certainly was, and particularly for me, I didn't have the knowledge or the analytical skills to try to dissect his speech and that. I was just like everybody else. I was just like being in church on Sunday, and so once King finished, the place went berserk, and so now we started to close in, and as you can see by the picture, just as he begins to finish the speech and is moving away from the podium, he's folding it, and we actually have on a video King folding the speech, and I said to him, "Dr. King, can I have that speech?" And he handed it to me.
You actually have that on video?
Yeah, CBS found it in the archives.
Is it online anywhere?
Oh yeah, it's on my website.
Oh, it is. Okay, yeah. I'm going to share that.
If you look at the James, there's about 5 different networks have done documentaries, but the one with CBS with James Brown, you can see it.
All right, I'll check that out.
And so
you just spontaneously have this idea that you.
Yeah, I don't know why. I'd love to have some great story that I had this whole thing premeditated, but I didn't. And so just as he handed it to me, the rabbi who was going to say in the benediction said to him, "Dr. King, that's the greatest speech I've ever heard. I loved your speech." And so his attention switched from me and his focus to the rabbi, and that was the end of it. And I just stuck it in my pocket. And then when it was over, we ushered him out. So now the leadership group, A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King and the other Byron Rustin and those people who led the march, they all go to the White House to meet the president. And when they walk into the Oval Office, President Kennedy says, Dr. King, he says, I loved your I Have a Dream speech. The speech has no title, but the media picked up on it and called it the I Have a Dream speech, which was unusual because that really was never
It wasn't even in the text.
No, it wasn't even
right.
in the text. And so that became the way that it was given its name by the media. But it was just a magnificent time. King had spent a lot of time the night before writing and rewriting the speech, and he actually grappled with trying to figure out how to get the I Have a Dream portion in, but it wasn't going to meet the timeline, and so he ultimately left it out. But
they let him go on for it was 16 minutes. Right?
Yeah, well, once he got up there, at that point there was no stopping him, and the crowd would have gone berserk if they tried to, because they had told people that, hey, if you go over, we're just going to cut the mic.
But he was the last one up anyway,
yes,
right?
Yes, and I mean, what does someone say? Don't mess with history.
Yeah. Well, speaking of history, so this speech goes down as, arguably one of the greatest speeches in American history, if not the history of humanity, up there with, Jack Kennedy's inauguration speech and
Churchill
the Gettysburg Address.
And the Gettysburg Address.
In the moment, was there a sense of that level of momentousness? I
don't think so, because I don't know that black people were ever allowed to think in such grand terms. Who would have ever thought that there would be a moment in history when there was an evaluation of speeches that moved the nation and moved the nation's conscience, and one of them would be by a black person. But we have to also be mindful that it took 50 years. Malcolm X said one time that history is best situated to reward all man's deeds. And so my interpretation of that is history is best situated to place things in their historic context. So it took 50 years for that speech to really be evaluated accurately and placed in the historic context as it related to other speeches that had a meaningful effect on our social system and our values.
And meanwhile, you have the actual text. You stick it in a book that was... I
had the actual speech.
Harry Truman's biography that he personally signed you.
The book is right behind you in the bookcase, too. Yeah. So what happened, my senior year in college, I played an East-West All-Star game in Kansas City, and they took us out to Independence, Missouri to meet President Truman. And when we were out there, when he was done visiting with us, he had about 3 tables with books stacked high on them. And he had written this 2-volume set on his presidency. And so he gave each of us a set, and mine says to George Raveling. It's got the date, 1960, and to George Raveling from Harry S. Truman. And both of them were signed like that. So I put the speech inside of it because I knew I'd remember, 2, that I would never throw those books away, because how many people can say that they have a personally autographed book by the President of the United States? Right. And so,
but you actually don't end up really remembering it, right? It sort of escapes your memory. You just
so for 25 years, I never thought about it. And my wife didn't even know, no one knew I had it, and I never talked about it because at that point it hadn't taken on its historic significance.
Even after the assassination.
No, how it became public was when I went from Washington State as head basketball coach to Iowa. When I got to Iowa, obviously the first black head coach there. And so at that time, most of the major newspapers had a Sunday magazine section that came with it. And the New York Times is one of the few papers that still have their own. And so the Cedar Rapids Gazette sent a reporter down to do this story on me. And so as going through the questions, I call it a throwaway question. He just said to me, Coach, were you ever involved in the civil rights movement? And I said, kind of. And he said, what do you mean, kind of? And I explained to him what happened. And he said, oh, my God, you have the speech. Where is it? And I said, it's down in the basement in some boxes, because I'd only been there about 2 or 3 weeks and I hadn't unpacked yet. And so we go down in the basement and we find it. And I thought the guy was going to have a heart attack. He was hyperventilating, and then he called the sports editor and said, "Oh my God, you can't believe what happened." And he asked, "Was it okay to send a photographer down to take a picture of it?" And so that was the first time that anyone knew that I had the speech. But even then, it didn't cause a gigantic uproar. I used to keep it on the wall in my office, but then once it became the government officially anointed a day for Martin Luther King Day. Now the story was getting around. ESPN had it on. Digger Phelps would always bring it up on a program that, Coach Raveling has the original speech. Mm-hmm. And so more and more people started to understand that I had it. And my wife got a little nervous because she felt, you travel a lot.
To get the house broken into.
Somebody break into the house. So she said, we got to move it out here and put it in the bank.
Take it out of the book.
Yeah. And so we moved it out of the house because, and she always said back in those days, make sure you keep saying publicly it's not in the house, because I don't want somebody breaking into our house and trying to, but it would be, if it were still in the house now, there would be a more likelihood that someone would probably try to break into the house now, because we live in such an unstable environment. But in those days, I don't know that there was any real threat to us. And people weren't really, in such a large city like Los Angeles, people weren't even sure where I lived.
Right. So over the years, I'm sure there's been suitors, people trying to buy this from you. Estimates run anywhere from, a couple $1 million all the way up to like $25 million. You've repeatedly, refused to sell it. But I would imagine, and I can understand the reasons behind that, and I want to dig into that a little bit more deeply, but it must have occurred to you, why not share it with, the Smithsonian, put it on loan so, everybody can enjoy it?
I agree with you, and that's exactly what we're going to do. I've been consistently saying that I was going to leave it to my son when I die, and that's still my intention. But even
as long as he doesn't sell it.
Yes, as long as he doesn't sell it. And so about 2 years ago, the gentleman who was the producer of the CBS documentary on me having this speech is a young man named Alvin Patrick, and he had encouraged me to go down and meet with the people at the new African American Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian. And I went down and I met with them, and they were very gracious. And it is our intention to get, I think it just opened a few weeks ago. And so it's
it's that beautiful new, they just built it,
yes,
right? Yeah,
yes.
I was just in Washington last week. I saw it. It's a magnificent looking building.
And so ultimately, within the next 12 months, it'll be housed there.
Oh, that's fantastic. Mm-hmm. That's great. So I can't help but wonder, you keep characterizing this as right place, right time, but on some level, it almost seems fated. You are this sort of paradigm-breaking person in sports in that, being the first African-American assistant coach at Villanova and then going on to coach at University of Washington and then Washington State, Iowa, and USC. And at each one of those sort of train stops, being the first African-American coach, again, set against this, kind of interesting time in the evolution of civil rights. And then being the, sort of repository of this landmark speech, on some level, doesn't the message seep through to you like, there's a reason behind all of this? Like, what is the responsibility that you feel to, speak to these issues as somebody who is, carrying on in the tradition of Dr. King and somebody who has himself, broken through barriers?
Well, I think that with each passing year, I became much more aware of what was the larger world around me, and I grew to understand that we lived out the cliches of the last hired and the first fired, that we live in ghettos. When I was growing up, I never even realized I lived in a ghetto until I got to Villanova and took a sociology class, and I was perfectly happy with my life, even though most of it was in a boarding school. But as I grew older, I began to put my life and my pursuits in a broader context, and I realized that one of the impediments that I was going to carry with me for the rest of my life was my pigmentation, and people were going to judge me differently. But over the years, I also grew to understand that the one thing that most people respect about another person is their intellect. Whether you're black or white, whatever, they might still have misgivings about you, but they will respect your intellect. And so I try to compensate by being an information gatherer, a knowledge gatherer, trying to learn as much as I could so that I could effectively compete in our social system, even if I had all the hardships and the drapings that came with segregation or discrimination. At the end of the day, it was incumbent upon me to figure out how can I successfully compete in this environment. What are the skills I need? What are the things I need to do? And one of those things was obviously to be able to have a courageous voice and stand up and speak out against injustice. Everybody can't be Malcolm X or Martin Luther King or Stokely Carmichael or Huey Newton. I think all of us have a role to play in life, and we have to figure out what that role is, and we have to play it. But at the end of the day, we have to accept the responsibility that it's a moral obligation to speak out against injustice and inequality, and here we are today, and it's a more sophisticated type of discrimination, and it's now not something that is just discrimination against a person because of the pigmentation of their skin. There's discrimination against women. There's discrimination against gays. There's discrimination against Latinos and that. And so it's become a societal problem in a real sense. I remember Monahan in his report, Senator Monahan, when he did the report on Black America, he suggested that the number one problem in Black America was the broken home structure, that you had this ever-growing population of black people, black children who were being raised in single-parent households, and because of the judicial system, the courts tended to award the child to the woman, the mother, and so they were growing up in a home without male role models, without male supervision. But what we soon began to realize that over the coming years, it really wasn't a black problem; it was an American problem, because we have equal amount of white children who grow up in single-parent households too. And so over the course of time, these so-called social and discriminatory systems became cancerous, and they grew, and they started to spread out beyond the black communities and into white communities, into Latin communities, into Asian communities, and And so over the years, I've watched this racial demographic journey to here. I go from Washington D.C. to Los Angeles. I live in a city now in Los Angeles where the ethnic breakdown is the dominant ethnic group in Los Angeles are Latinos, Asians, blacks, whites.
Mm-hmm. And so much progress has been made. Here we are in the twilight of the 8 years of the Obama administration, first African American president. Professionals, the NBA, the NFL is got to be around 80% African American at this point in terms of players, which is a massive shift from your days of being a player and perhaps the early days of you coaching. And yet we're also in a social and political climate that seems more divided than ever. So when you think about, you had mentioned earlier, we all have a role to play. How do you think about and articulate how you see yourself? Like, what is your role? Like, how would you define what your role in this grand play is?
I see myself as a servant leader. I think at this juncture in my life, I'm kind of on the other side of the mountain now at 79, and so I fully recognize it's no longer about me, it's about them. And so I have to reach out and try to positively affect as many lives as I can. And so my mission every day is to be a positive difference maker in as many lives of people as I can, black folks and white folks. But and I try to target young people and share with them my life lessons in hopes that my grandma used to say, if you listen to me, I can help you avoid some of the bumps and potholes in the road. And so that I to this day, I still feel that that's my mission, to help other people avoid some of the potholes in the road, because I've lived the life that they have to live. And so I'm going to spend all of the rest of my remaining life trying to be a positive difference maker in as many lives as I possibly can. And when I look back now in my life, I've lived a variety of lives. I truly believe, when I look back on my life, that you live your life in buckets. Say 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. But when I was 40 years old, I was no longer the person I was when I was 30 years old. And at 79, I'm not the same person I was at 69.
What's the biggest difference?
I think, one, you're in a constant, your values change, your interests change, your health changes, your thinking changes. And then you get to a point where you have no choice anymore about changing. Technology has ushered into my life and forced me to take on a whole new existence. I mean, I have to learn the language of technology. I have to learn the utilization of technology. I have to learn the value that it creates for me. And fortunately, it came at a time in my life with the proper use of technology. It's allowed me to remain relevant and a time in my life that's very important, because now I'm able to transfer from old thinking to new thinking, from old knowledge to new knowledge. To be successful and compete in society today, we have to relearn things. We have to rethink things. We have to acquire new knowledge that's relevant at this time.
I would imagine it must get harder as you get older. I mean, most people who are, settling into their 70s and 80s are kind of, the catchphrase where you're just stuck in your ways. Like at some point that evolution sort of stops, and, you're just not going to get the new iPhone. It's just not going to happen, or you're not going to figure out the new TV remote. It's like you draw a line in the sand and you're like done. But what I'm hearing you say is, you are committed to.
You're only done if you think you're done.
Well, the amazing thing is you have this incredibly robust website. Like when I went to your website the first time, I thought, oh, so just it'll have your bio. I didn't expect there to be very much content, and yet there's all kinds of articles there and podcasts and video interviews and the book club, and here's my monthly, recommendations for what you should be reading, like a ton of amazing, really helpful, inspiring content. And I thought, wow, this guy's like really with what's going on right now. And that must take, a level of attention and energy and focus that I think most people at your age probably just aren't that interested in.
Well, you go back to what I said before, is that I can control my environment now. So you rarely ever see me, other than with, and my wife is not the same age as that, but you'll rarely ever see me hang around with or associate with people that are my own age. I'll be
you and Ryan Holiday hanging out.
No, I hang around with younger people because they help me think young. They teach me how to use technology. I can listen to them. And they're all the young people are my mentors. They're the ones they're my teachers. They're my professors right now, and they stimulate me because if I hang around with people my own age, the talk's always going to be about the past and the now. Young people are they're looking into the future. They're defining what the future is. And so I find it stimulating to be around them and to listen and hang on to their coattail, because if I hang on, they're going to drag me into the future with them. And that's where I want to be. My biggest challenge is I'm an African-American ex-basketball coach, 69 years old. How do I stay relevant in this contemporary time? I don't want to be put in a position where I'm living my life in reverse. I want to live my life in going forward. And so what I've done is I boiled it down to this equation and this question, and the question I ask myself on a consistent basis is this: what is it that I don't know but I need to know to remain relative and competitive and growing and prospering in today's society? And then I constantly are in search of what I don't know, but what I need to know. And the great part about it is all I got to do is go on my iPhone, hit Google, and I can educate myself. I told my wife the other day, I said, you know what? I'm tired of hearing them night after night quoting these polls, and with as if we are to accept those as being valid. Because I have all kind of questions. Okay, who did you poll? I'm 79, never have been polled once in my life. How many people did you poll? What were the questions that you asked? What was their political affiliation? I got a lot of things. So I told my wife, I said, you know what? I'm going to educate myself so that I can critically analyze and think about this thing about polls, and I'm going to start questioning all these assumptions about polls. So I Googled, and I went on Google and I asked for books on political polls, and about 20 of them came up, and so I picked out 5 of them and I ordered them, and I'm going to read it, and 60 days from now, I am going to be challenging people.
An expert.
I'm going to be challenging.
Come November.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge people's.
I like it.
And I'm going to challenge the networks when they give us this. I mean, Quinnipiac or New York Times or Wall Street's poll. Well, what makes their opinion any more valid than your opinion or my opinion?
Yeah, there's a lot of science that goes into crafting those questions to drive a certain result. Well, I could talk to you about this stuff for like 6 hours, but I know we're on a little bit of a leash here. So
we got to do it again.
Well, I'm just sitting here thinking while you're answering. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to get to all the stuff I want to talk to you about. So you're going to definitely have to come back and we can fill in the gaps. But maybe we can shift gears a little bit here and just talk about coaching in general. This has been your career. You're one of the great legendary coaches of all time. So I'm interested in your thoughts about how you perceive the importance of coaching and what are the distinguishing features of a great coach? What makes a great coach great?
Well, I'll try to answer the last part of it first. I think what makes a great coach great is his ability or her ability to consistently get the athlete to operate at peak efficiency, to get the absolute best out of each individual and to motivate them to greater heights. to me, coaching is one of the greatest honors you can ever have in your lifetime. And so why do I feel that way? Because a parent is going to take their most valuable possession, their child, and they're going to put them in your hands, and they're going to allow you to influence them. And so you have a huge responsibility. I recruited a young man named Mark Boyd from Stone Mountain, Georgia, when I was at USC. And after his mom signed the letter of intent and she was walking me to the door, she looked at me and she said, "Coach Raveling, I don't want no foolishness out of you now." And I knew what she meant. Hey, I've raised this young man with a certain value system, and I expect you to expand on that. I expect you to respect that. And so to me, I feel sincerely, and this was a motivating factor with me, if all a young man learned during the 4 years he was with me, because in those days you didn't have one and done, if all I taught him was how to shoot jump shots and rebound and play defense and win basketball games, hell, he could have gone anywhere and got that. I want the 4 years with me to be a unique experience. I want the things that he learned to spill over from the basketball court into everyday life. You have a responsibility as a coach to tell him how the game, athletics, prepares him for the game of life. Because at the end of the day, the most important game to win is the game of life. And so,
and what's your core philosophy at the bottom of that? Like what,
well, I think it's a system that it's a secondary system of education. You learn so much about life lessons from participation in athletics. You learn you don't win all the time, you don't lose all the time. You learn you have to sacrifice, you have to be a team player, you have to be teachable and coachable, you have to play with whites and blacks and Hispanics. You learn that you've got to be a listener, you got to make quick decisions on the run. There's so many things that you learn from athletics. You learn leadership. And so all these things are the early preparation for your transformation from participating in sports, and you take those values with you into society. But we have to get people to see the connection between their participation and its preparation for you in the future. Very small segment of kids are going to make it to the NBA, and probably less than 1% of the black kids in America are ever going to play in the NBA. But their participation can be more important and should be more important than participating in the NBA. And that's what bothers me about this one and done. One and done puts too much emphasis on material things and money and not enough emphasis on education. That's what I worry about it. I don't deny that a young person is physically talented enough to participate at that level. But does he have the educational fundamentals that he's going to need? If you're making $100 million a year, you can't even sit in a meeting and ask an intelligent question because you don't have the educational background.
Well, and if you don't have a mature character, then you're probably going to make some bad decisions.
Absolutely. And I used to do a talk called Voices and Choices, and the thesis is that the voices you listen to are the ones that determine the choices that you make. And so at the end of the day, if you listen to enough of the right voices, you'll make the right choices. If you listen to enough to the wrong voices, you're going to make bad choices. And I think today, when you look at the compensation for professional athletics, education is more important today than it ever was. If you can couple education with a professional career and the compensation that you have, you can help change the world, because you've got to be able to put the physical with the mental. See, there's far too much emphasis on the physical now and not enough emphasis on the mental.
Is that what you would characterize as the most common mistake or misstep that most coaches make?
Absolutely, and it starts on the basketball court, because you hear of all this skill development today in athletics, but it's so out of balance, because all the skill development does with the physical. There's no one spending a whole lot of time working with the athlete on the mental part of the game. If you can combine the physical with the mental, you got a heck of a thing going for you now.
One of the things that everybody says about you is that you were this amazing recruiter. You had an eye and an ability to really spot talent, like above and beyond. So when you are in that capacity, what are you looking for? Like, what is the defining characteristic of the great athlete, or the unpolished gem, or what is the difference between somebody who, in your eyes, is good or has the potential to be good, and that rare special athlete who could be fantastic?
I don't know that it's any one thing. I would think at the end of the day, some of the things I try to look at an athlete and not look at necessarily where he is now or where she is now, but where can they be 5 years or 10 years from now? Are they coachable? Are they teachable? Do they have a passion for the game? What type of skills do they have? Have they reached their ceiling? And one of the reasons I think I achieved success at Washington State was because I was never able to get the superstar. I think in recruiting, anybody can go out and watch Willie Mays or O.J. Simpson play and conclude that they're going to be a star. Mm-hmm. But it's that guy that's a notch. I mean, let's take the present day flavor of the month, Steph Curry. I mean, most of his life he's been in a constant battle to prove people wrong. He's too small. He's too thin. He can't guard anybody. But he took that and used it as a motivator to propel him where he is today, and so now he's the MVP of the league. But we have to remember he couldn't get a scholarship coming out of high school. Davidson picked him up at the end. Virginia Tech wouldn't even take him as a walk-on, where his dad went to school.
You could have spotted him out of high school?
Do I think? Yeah. No, I don't know that I would have. I might have been a little bit more intrigued of him because of his ability to shoot the ball. Because at the end of the day, the game of basketball comes down to putting the ball in the basket and stopping it from getting in the basket. And so he had a unique skill right away. He knew how to get it in the basket. All those other offenses and all that stuff are fine, but you don't need an offense for Steph Curry. You just give him the ball, and he gets across half court. He picks it up, shoots, boom, goes in the basket, and it simplifies the game in the process.
I got to let you go. We're at our time limit. And I can't believe it, because we didn't even talk about all the things that you do at Nike. I wanted to talk to you about the
we're going to do it
Olympics,
again.
All kinds of stuff. I'm sitting here with all these notes that I didn't even get to. But this has been brilliant and amazing. You're quite the inspiring character. I really appreciate your time. It's an absolute pleasure to talk to you. So thanks a lot.
I wanted to kind of get like these modern TV shows now, where there's a Q&A, where the person that's being asked the questions, they start interviewing the person who's doing it. So I didn't even get a chance.
Maybe I need a new co-host. You can come in every once in a while and chime in.
Coach's I want to talk to you about swimming at Stanford and go back and heck, I had teams with 5 guys who, if I combined all their SATs, they couldn't have gotten to Stanford.
Times changed. I don't think I could get in there anymore now either. But fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you're digging on this, the best way to connect with you, you're all over the place, but your website is CoachGeorgeRaveling.com.
Yes.
And on there you can find the podcast and the videos and articles.
I put up 5 new books every month. There's easily a
So what are the books on the list? Maybe we can leave everybody with a reading list.
Well, the book of the month is Ryan's book on ego.
Of course.
And
everybody already knows about that one.
Yes.
Maybe
yeah.
what's the other book that you tend to hand out quite a bit?
Actually, one of the books that I recommend is an old book. It's called What They Don't Teach You at Harvard Business School by Mark McCormick. That was a book that greatly influenced my life. There's a book out now that I think is a little bit of a sleeper book. I don't remember the author's name now, but it's called Practice Perfect. I have it on a coffee table in my office. And one of my good friends is a professor at Wharton School in Penn, and she was the one who pointed it out to the book to me, and what made me go buy the book immediately was she said this is one of the best business books I've read in a long time, and she reads 100 books a year. So the fact that she said it was one of the best she ever read, I went out and got it, and it's called Practice Perfect. I don't recall the author's name now, but
I'll put a link to it in the show notes for people that want to check it out.
But as you can see from my collection here, I really have.
You got quite a few things here. Yeah, it's pretty cool. And you're on Twitter at George Raveling. You got a Facebook page, all that kind of stuff. So reach out to George, tell him you enjoyed the interview, and let's do this again really soon.
Absolutely. When you let me know, we'll get on each other's calendar. If I have to come out to Malibu, I'll come out to Malibu.
All right, yeah, we'll cook a meal for you.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Peace. Plants.